Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline, and I create knitting content here on YouTube. In today's video, I'll be showing you how to make this ear warmer. The different skills that I'm going to show along the way are how to cast on, do make one left, make one right, place stitches on waste yarn, take stitches off waste yarn, decrease, and then finally bind off and seam together. As always, all the different steps that I'm using will have the timestamps down in the description box below. That way, if you're just looking for a specific step, you can see exactly where to start the video, or if you're looking for where to rewatch a step, you know how far back to go. Also down in the description box, you'll find the written version of this pattern. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. I hope you enjoy. Starting off with the materials that we need for this project. First, you need your knitting needle. So this project is knit flat, so you can either use a circular knitting needle and just knit back and forth, or you can use traditional straight knitting needles. I prefer to use a circular knitting needle. So this is a size US 10 knitting needle. You can use any length cord that you want. A little bit longer would be better, just so that it's easier to knit flat. You also need one tapestry needle. Then you need some waste yarn to hold some stitches as we're knitting along. So this is just some yarn that's left over from a different project. If you have a stitch holder, you can also use that in place of the waste yarn. And now finally for the yarn, in this project I'm going to be holding yarn double. So what I have here, it's called the Bling Bling yarn by We Are Knitters. So I have the natural and beige colors, and I'm going to hold them double, so knit with 2 strands at one time. You're going to need 60 yards of each color, so there's plenty here to do that. Alternatively, if you don't want to hold your yarn double and knit that way, you're going to need about 60 yards of a chunky weight yarn. To cast on using 2 different strands, holding them double, what I do is I just line up both strands, so basically both the tails start at the same place. And for this one we need to cast on 16 stitches. I always like to have an extra long tail, so that way we can use that for seaming at the end. So I'm going to have about 2 feet as my tail. Now I'm going to make a slip knot. So the way I do that is I lay the tail over my hand, so the tail's coming out the bottom, working yarn's coming out the top, and then I wrap it around up and over my pointer finger 2 times. So basically I now have like 3 loops going up my finger. Grab the working yarn with my other 3 fingers to hold it tight, and now you're going to want to take the second loop, bring it up over the first loop, take the new second loop, bring that one up over the first loop, and now you're going to want to slide this off while holding on to this second loop. Slide it off of your finger, and when you do that, you've created a slip knot. So now we're going to want to take that slip knot and put it on our knitting needle. So the way I put it on my knitting needle is I have the tail coming out the front and the working yarn coming out the back, and then you can pull on the tail and that tightens it onto the knitting needle. We now have our slip knot on the needle, and we're going to begin casting on. So the slip knot does count as the first stitch. So now what we're going to want to do to cast on the next 15 stitches is we aren't going to use our tail for this one. We're just going to use the yarn that's coming out of the balls of yarn, or the working yarn. So we're going to put our hand behind the working yarn, then grab it with 3 of the fingers. And now, similar to the slip knot, we're going to take our finger up and over that strand of yarn and wrap it around 1 time. Now you're going to want to bring the tip of your finger up near the needle and then slide your knitting needle under that loop we wrapped around the finger. So that's the next stitch we're casting on. So to show that one more time, we're going to grab the yarn with our 3 fingers, then take our finger and go up and over the strand of yarn, wrap it around once, take the tip of your pointer finger up towards the needle, and then slide the knitting needle under that strand. So now we have 3 stitches cast on. So we're going to continue doing this until we have a total of 16 stitches cast on. And just to make sure again that you aren't using your tail, I'm just holding my tail kind of with my other hand because we're just going to use that at the end to seam. I now have 16 stitches cast on, so I'm going to turn my needle, and again move the tail out of the way, and now we're just going to knit into that first row. And when you're knitting into the 2 strands, make sure you're getting both of them and not just one. And you will notice with this cast on too, sometimes when you separate the needles, you end up with this bar in between. Don't worry about that, just keep on knitting along. The bar evens out. Now that we knit that row, we're going to turn our work again, and we're going to knit across again. So now we're going to continue knitting row after row, so knit on every single side until this piece measures 6 inches from the cast on edge. So just measure from down at the bottom, and then I typically measure to the bottom of the knitting needle. So continue knitting row after row until the piece measures 6 inches. I've now finished knitting my 6 inches. So this next row that I'm going to do, I'm going to want to knit across but add 2 increases right in the middle. So I'm going to knit 8, increase right here, which I'll show you in a second, and then knit the remaining 8 stitches. So let me knit my first 8. I'm halfway across, I needed to increase 2 stitches. So I'm doing a make one right and then a make one left. So how you do these 2 stitches is you look for the bar that's in between the stitch you just worked and the one you're about to knit down below. So if you stretch out your work, you can see that there's this kind of top bar that forms here. So to do a make one right, first you take your left needle point, you go underneath that bar from the back to the front, and then you knit into the front of that loop. So it kind of twists over the needle a little strangely. So you just got to get your needle to go basically from left to right into the front of that loop. Knit that. So that's our make one right. And now we also want to do a make one left into that same bar. So here's the bar again. So now we're going to go the opposite direction where we take our left needle point and go from front to back underneath that bar. And now we want to knit into the back of that loop. So now that we've done that make one right and make one left, I'm going to continue knitting across the row. Now that I've completed that first increase row, I've turned my work and I'm ready to do the second increase row. So on this one, we're going to focus on the first 9 stitches and then placing the remaining stitches on waste yarn. So here, I'm going to knit 9. Now that I've knit those 9, I'm going to make one right. So if you stretch out your work, you can see that there is kind of like a top loop. I'm going to go back to front underneath that loop and then knit into the front of that loop. So that's going to be one side. And now we're going to place these remaining 9 stitches on waste yarn. To put stitches on waste yarn, I've just threaded my tapestry needle, and now I'm just going to slide them purlwise onto the tapestry needle. Now that I've done that, I usually just take this waste yarn and I'll just tie a little bow with it just so it's easy to get out, but that it's kind of out of the way as well. So now those stitches are secure, so we can come back to them later. Now, all we do here is we turn our work, and we're gonna continue knitting just this portion of 10 stitches for 5 inches. So basically, just a rough estimate, you can just go from the cast on edge up until the bottom of the needle, and you'll want that to be 11 inches total when you're all done. And you're gonna wanna finish so that your working yarn is on this outer edge. So that way it'll help us line them up later. But yeah, finish knitting those next 5 inches, and you're gonna wanna finish. So right now my working yarn would be on the inner edge, so I'd have to knit across to get my working yarn on the outer edge. I've now finished knitting the 5 inches in this center portion. And as I noted, my working yarn is gonna be on the outer edge now. So I just finished knitting across here. I'm gonna turn my work, and now the final row we're gonna wanna do is gonna be to knit until 2 stitches before the end, and then knit these 2 stitches together. So a knit 2 together, you just take your right needle and you're gonna go inside of both stitches as if basically you're gonna knit them, but you're knitting 2 now. Wrap your yarn around and pull through. So now we just turn those 2 stitches into just 1. Now, I'm gonna use a different piece of waste yarn, but you can just rearrange your needle strategically, and so you only have to use one piece of waste yarn. But I'm gonna wanna place these stitches on waste yarn and pick up these ones. I'm just going to slide all the stitches that I was just working on onto the waste yarn. It doesn't matter which side you start onto when you're sliding the stitches onto the waste yarn, just that was the easier side for me to do it from. And now again, I'm going to tie a little bow. And I'm gonna break this yarn, leaving enough to weave in later, so I usually leave about 6 inches or so. And now I need to pick up the stitches that we were working on down here. So the way I figure out how I want to pick up these stitches is, I know I want to knit from the inside to the outside when I originally start knitting. And that's because we started this row, we were knitting across, then we stopped knitting here and put these on waste yarn. So basically we have to finish going across that row. So I'm gonna undo my bow down here. And now starting at the outside, I'm gonna take my needle, let me get this to focus real quick. I'm gonna take my needle and just follow along that waste yarn, picking up each one of those stitches. So you can either do it as a couple and then pull the waste yarn through as you go, or you can try and get all of them at once. Either way works. And once you finish, you should have 9 stitches on the needle. To start knitting this next side, it starts off with a make one left. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my left needle point, go from front to back underneath the bar in between the two. And in this case, it's not the bar in between the one you just worked and the one you're about to work. It's just kind of the bar that's in between the side we already did and the new side. Go into the back of that stitch. And now to join the new yarn, I essentially just leave about a 6 or 7 inch tail again, and then just lay this yarn over the needle and pull it through. So that first stitch will be a little loose, but again, you can just tighten that up when you're weaving in the ends. And now we continue knitting across this row. We're going to continue knitting until these pieces are almost the exact same length. So basically you want to stop kind of one row before this one. And the way I do that is I just look at the bumps and count these number of bump rows. So you should end up with the same number on both. And we want to finish this side once we have the working yarn is on the inside. So you want to have just about the same length. You'll essentially be like one row shorter, and the working yarn will be on the inside. So I'm going to continue knitting, and I'll show you what that looks like when I'm there. I've now finished knitting this section over here, and you can see my working yarn is now in the center. So now I'm going to turn my work, and I'm going to knit that final row, which has the decrease at the beginning. So to start off, I'm going to do a knit 2 together, and then knit across the remainder of the row. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to knit across this first one, doing my decrease right here, then pick up these remaining stitches and continue knitting right across there. So to show you that, so I'm going to knit until there's 2 left. And then once you get here, I'm going to do a knit 2 together. And in this portion too, with these decreases, if you want to, you can definitely do right leaning and left leaning decreases. I just decided to only do knit 2 together to simplify it a little bit. Now before I pick them up, I'm going to want to rearrange my knitting so that it's twisted the exact way I want it to. So let me zoom out here. So the optimal number of twists that I found is to do it once and then actually go one more time. So I've taken, it's easiest if you move the one with the waste yarn on it. So I bring it underneath first, and then basically I bring it back over on top again. So basically it's like they ended up in the exact same places they were before, just they've gone around once. So now that I've done that, I'm gonna go across and pick up these stitches from the outside to the inside. Now taking the needle that I already had my working stitches on, I'm just going to start off with a knit 2 together and then continue going right across that row. Now I've reattached them together. Let me zoom out again real quick. So you can see my twist in there. And now I'm going to continue knitting until this portion up here measures 6 inches. So you want it to be symmetric. I've now finished knitting that final 6 inches, and this time it's fine whatever side you end up on, because this edge we're just going to cast off and then use the tail to seam. And one thing to note too, this always made me nervous the first time I was knitting it, is that sometimes it would unwind, so I was looking at it and it looked like this. But that's not a problem at all, because we'll fix it when we sew it together. So just lay it flat like this, and it'll go back to normal again. But I was always, the first time I did it, I was always concerned that I twisted these the wrong way somehow and it was getting messed up. But no, there's not a problem if that happens. So to do the cast off, zoom in. I'm just going to do a basic cast off. So just do knit the first stitch, knit the second stitch, then pass the first or like the furthest one back on the right needle over the newest one and off the needle. And you're going to knit another stitch from the left needle, then pass the further back stitch over the newest stitch and off the needle. And continue doing this all the way across the row. Once you get to the last one, I just pull on it a little bit with my last needle. Then I break my yarn. So I already have a long tail down on the other end, so I'm not going to leave this one too long. But you're going to want to have a little bit of length on one of the sides, just so that way you have enough to seam with. I break my yarn, and then I pull it through this last stitch that I have. So now you're just going to lay it so the twist appears the way you'd like, and then fold the two ends together. And now I'm going to thread my tapestry needle with one of my two tails. And now I'm going to seam together the two sides. So I'm just picking up the first stitch on this side, and then on this side along the cast off edge, it's a little easier to see what to pick up. So I'm just picking up both legs of those little triangles. And I'm going to continue going all the way down this edge. Here's my finished ear warmer. And what I did is I just finished seaming along the edge, and then I weaved in all my ends. Now, if you ever wanted to adjust the size of this, you could definitely do that. So if you wanted to adjust basically how far it went around your head, you could just switch the 6 inches on each side and just make them an even number. And then if you ever wanted to increase or decrease the thickness, you just want to pick an even number, so that way you're able to divide it by 2 to make the twist up top. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments down below.